All right, John, Josh, you're up. Yeah, that's the problem with the mirrored screen is it is over there, and then we go to that side, and we go to this side. There we are. Where'd you go?
So while we're technologying, I did tweet under the SBOM hashtag a couple of graphics we will walk through. This is the use cases and state of practice working group. In a lot of projects like this, I think the scope and goals are framing. Oh, yes.
Could I suggest introducing yourself?
Yes, we will.
Thank
Yes.
Why don't you do that?
We'll do that as well. So I'm Joshua Corman, Chief Security Officer at PTC.
And I'm John Banghart, Senior Director for Cyber Services at Venable.
I've been on the SBOM topic for, I think, 6 years and counting. But what we wanted to do was, instead of say, maybe someday we could do this, we wanted to capture 6+ years of state of practice. And what you'll find, and we've had to iterate several times, is it's fairly confusing for folks what we mean by SBOM. Which is one of the reasons I tweeted out at the SBOM hashtag 3 columns. The green one is really what we tried to frame at the first meeting here on July 19th. So in lieu of me pulling up that graphic for a moment, essentially think of an SBOM at its bare bones. The least controversial version is it's in an ingredients list without judgment. It's what's in the software. The part number of the version names, we don't have to have debate on SPDX per se or SWID. We will, but in its most atomic form, it's a list of ingredients. Where people sometimes get in trouble is column 2, where they try to enrich it with potentially exploitable vulnerabilities in the National Vulnerability Database. And that is one of the use cases we're going to show graphically. At a firefight, when Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital got shut down for a week, they were warned in advance of a flaw in JBoss. They just didn't know what a JBoss was or which of the thousands of pieces of equipment might contain a JBoss of the affected version. So answering am I affected and where am I affected can make great use of the second column of a list of potentially exploitable vulnerabilities. But it could also create a lot of noise where people are saying, get rid of all these bad vulnerabilities. They're only potentially exploitable. And then column 3, we talked about often, which...
Do you want that up?
Yes, please. Just the first one. Okay. Column 3, we talked about this is a bad metaphor, call it a nutrition label, which can include the ingredients, but may go beyond that to say, hey, this is the attack surface. So yeah, there's a lot of parts in it, but only these 12 are exposed. These are the mitigations in place. This is a list of triaged vulnerabilities. So out of maybe 100 potentially exploitable vulnerabilities, maybe 10 of them are actually exploitable, and someone can make an attestation that can persist across stakeholders and across time. We decided on the July 19th meeting, let's focus on the first column, the bare bones ingredients from which the other 2 could be derived or enriched by someone else at a later date. I don't think we're going to necessarily avoid those in perpetuity, but at least for today's deliverable, we focused on that ingredients list. How's the technology going?
Terribly.
Terribly. Okay.
I don't know what's in it.
So you can refer to your Twitter if you're on the Twitters. I'm at Josh Corman.
No, not that one. We want the pictures.
Oh, okay.
But there's no pictures showing. So
All right.
there it goes.
This computer is...
Doing it that way.
Okay.
Ooh, pretty.
Okay, let me see what I can do with it.
Okay.
I'll take it off to duplicate it later.
Okay. All right. So we're going to try to tell a little story. One thing to point out is that has not been raised yet, but I can see Aft in the back, so I'm going to make the point. While Commerce Department and NTIA is a voluntary best practice working group to work with industry and all the different stakeholders for capturing and promoting best practices and better practices and whatnot, there is an interesting point of history we're in where the Food and Drug Administration, which is a regulator with regulatory authority, has declared It's partly my fault, but has declared that their pre-market update will require a CBOM, or a cyber bill of materials, which is hardware and software. I suspect during this open draft comment period, people will push back really, really hard on the hardware part, maybe successfully, we'll see. But the idea was essentially surfaced during a congressional task force on healthcare cybersecurity that came out of the CISA law, the Computer Information Security Act of 2015. We did a 1.5-year-long task force, and in that we realized one of the ways to insulate Hollywood Presbyterian from that JBoss ransomware, that even though they were warned, they were still hit because they couldn't answer am I affected and where am I affected, therefore couldn't patch or remediate. One of the things that came out of that recommendation list, about 116 if I recall, was to require a software bill of materials for all medical technologies. And the Committee of Jurisdiction and Oversight in the House said, hey, we like that. In fact, it was right around this time. It was right before Thanksgiving last year. They said, hey, we like that. HHS, go do that. So HHS is doing that. And their public workshop is late January. So they will be using regulatory authority for medical technologies, irrespective of what we do here. But their hope and sincere desire is that this collaborative multi-stakeholder process comes up with something really good and evergreen that can apply beyond medical technologies. So FDA will be using its regulatory on medical devices, but maybe not electronic medical record systems. That's a different jurisdiction. And there's also lots of other technology stacks in hospitals. So we use this graphic to try to make this a little clearer.
Good.
We're good?
Yep. It's auto forwarding, so I'll
All right.
keep managing.
Okay. So let's start our little story here. This is a bedside infusion pump. It's one of the most common technologies in a hospital. This is a metaphor for what we're doing, not the entire story. This particular make and model of medical device is one. It is but one infusion pump. There are many, but this one is my infusion pump. And hospitals will choose this infusion pump amongst others based on price, functionality, quality, maintenance, all sorts of other things. But increasingly, folks like the Mayo Clinic and others are selecting these based on the relative hygiene of the cybersecurity and the ability to produce an SBOM, or software bill of materials, and how well they maintain the vulnerabilities within it. Even Underwriters Laboratories has the Cyber Assurance Program, which includes, among other things, a requirement to capture a software bill of materials. But that infusion pump was not made exclusively by that infusion pump, Acme infusion pump manufacturer. We're going to use Acme here, no real company names, hopefully. It comes from a whole bunch of open source stuff and third-party licensed stuff. In fact, certain statistics will vary, but they argue and hover around about 90% of the software in these final goods assembled comes from third-party open source sources, often these mega projects like Apache Struts 2, which took out Equifax, which took out every financial services company in July 2013. So these big fat pipes are essentially compound projects like Struts or Spring or Juice or jQuery, and those little tendrils are essentially the dependent projects that they build upon too, because it's turtles on turtles. And then lastly, I think you can see faintly a bunch of tiny little aerosol atomic products. This could be a single logging framework. It could be a single string parser like Xstream. And those can be pretty nasty when put together. Now, if we put labels on these, what we've tried to abstract in our use case capture is a daisy chain that starts with parts, gets to compound parts. Those can be 1 through N in between themselves. It gets to a final goods assembled. In this case, for the FDA, they're going to regulate that medical device. And then it gets to a consumer or operator. We've oscillated between the terms consumer or operator. But someone buys that thing, deploys that thing, and maintains it safely through retirement. So those are the 4 columns in which we've started to elicit and capture personas, intents, use cases, supporting business process, and artifacts. Is my pace okay? Okay. Well, let's annotate this. Let's tell a little story with this. One more click, please. Okay, so it might be hard to see, but this is red. And this infusion pump's red because there's a CVE, or common vulnerability exposure, in that Struts 2 fat white pipe, right? That white compound project has a vulnerability in it, and therefore the 3 hospitals who depend upon this device could be affected. Right now, this is a very haphazard reactive thing. There's an attack in the wild. People say, am I affected? I don't know. I can't tell. And we heard passionately from a few medical practitioners, including Jennings Oskey, who's running a different working group, that they had to make dozens of phone calls during WannaCry to ask their vendors, are we affected or not? Phone calls, and they couldn't get answers. So phone calls don't work well at the speed of attack. We can imagine a world, though, where if you're someone like the Mayo Clinic or Cleveland Clinic or Cedars-Sinai, you start demanding these in your purchasing, having a bill of materials allows you to at least shortlist, hey, which of these things has this version of this particular vulnerable library? So that's an attack scenario currently done imperfectly, but to increasing value in an isolated use case. Next. Now, again, we're not going to use any vendor names, but my aha moment was July 13th, 2013, because Apache Struts 2 hit all our banks. So all the banks that wrote their own software systematically eradicated that vulnerable version within a couple days. It was really impressive. The problem was a few days later, their third-party enterprise software infected them again because it too was using this. So we're not going to use any company names, but HAL, Cloud Cube here, is also in the clinical environment. And HAL Cloud Cube also uses Apache Struts too. So even if you had patched this through your Acme Infusion pump, we now have the problem of HAL got hurt too, right? And these are still at the compound project level. So if you click, I think you should see red on the hospitals again. But the more insidious one, and one of the reasons we really have to do a great job collectively here, so we're talking about mission and what's the big picture and who are the deliverables and stakeholders, even if we can get really focused on maybe the big projects that attack the most, like Apache Struts 2 or OpenSSL or OpenSSH, things like that, it's the really insidious little things. So picture way off in the weeds there, a single atomic library. Let's say that HAL Cloud Cube decides to use Spring instead of Struts. So maybe they're not affected by that anymore. But click one more time. A single vulnerability in that little downstream pigtail dependence can make its way both into Struts and into Spring. And something like Xstream is a particularly insidious example because it's a vulnerability that never got a CVSS score, so no one prioritized it. People didn't know they had it as a transitive dependency. And if you've read some of the good work by Dennis Cruz, it's trivial to exploit. So it's one of those things where the benefit of a more comprehensive and holistic software bill of materials could give a picture in the future where this is less bespoke, less single handoffs between these stakeholders. What if we could light up like a Christmas tree that one flaw affects these major libraries and these 7 brands of infusion pumps and desktop software, which affect these hospitals or don't? Instead of us asking, am I affected and where am I affected? After a headline of an attack in the wild, we may simply get an alert saying, hey, this vulnerability needs remediation. Please plan accordingly well before an attack manifests. So there's an opportunity to get from current state to desired state. And we're not kidding when we say that people in this room could save lives, because it's not just the medical technologies like these bedside infusion pumps, which I think the FDA is doing a fantastic job cranking up the heat on. It's also the desktop software, the HVAC stuff. If anybody saw our clinical hacking simulations in Phoenix, Arizona that we did, we actually came in through default passwords in the building automation system, elevators and HVAC and EMRs. So one of the reasons I don't want to just, my heart's desire, I don't want to just make the FDA the experiment here, is if we actually want to protect hospitals, we can't just look at the medical devices. We have to look at the software that exposes those. In fact, most of the WannaCry infections were not through medical devices, but through workstations. So that flow of parts, compound parts, final goods assembled, and operators, there's, dots before and after those, because your customers can have customers as well. If you're a service provider, if you're a factory. So we tended to go fairly deeply here on a medical, but not only medical. And what we've done is we've sliced up an actual Google Doc spreadsheet, which I tweeted a link to just before we walked up here, where you could peruse, and we've split it up into rows for domains. So there'll be, domain agnostic software like enterprise, commercial, off-the-shelf software, COTS. That could be things that you could name right now and what you all use that could expose any of us or all of us. It could be individual open source projects in a vacuum that are not domain or industry specific. But then we also have some columns that are more specific, like medical, like financial services. There's been significant use cases in innovation in financial services. In fact, one of the things I wanted to comment on, and the first thing is, I don't think this working group is all about security and risk management. The overwhelming driving force in financial services was productivity enhancement and developer productivity, and reclaiming hundreds or thousands of hours of developer productivity for not doing unplanned, unscheduled rework. So they did these kind of things to be on time, on budget, and we heard some of those voices in the room last time, and hopefully they're on the phone. So one of the use cases we can share with you is actually a financial services procurement one, but there are many reasons and benefits to look at the quality of the parts there. So as I pivot quickly, now that the graphics are working, you might notice an S1, S2, S3 in every one of those major columns. For consistency with Deming, a lot of this inspiration came from Edwards Deming and Toyota Supply Chain Management in the 40s. He had three principles that drove his activities: to make a textile company the most profitable automotive manufacturer in the world for 30 years. Number one, I'll repeat these, but number one, use fewer and better suppliers of parts. Number two, use the highest quality parts from those high quality suppliers. In fact, we have some automakers in the room. And number three, track which parts went where throughout the product's life cycle, such that when something goes wrong, you do a prompt and agile recall. So again, fewer and better parts suppliers, highest quality parts from those suppliers, and track which parts go where, which is essentially where we get the notion of a BOM, a bill of materials. SBOM is an unfortunate acronym that is an extension of that. So what we did is we took those and we put them in our spreadsheet with greater text as there's a set of activities or personas that do supplier selection. So if we're going to buy infusion pumps in the operator environment, let's go to the last column, S1. If I'm procurement for a hospital, I'm going to come up with my purchasing criterion for which vendors I think are worth my business for the next 5 years. So supplier is really at the vendor level. Do they have a coordinated disclosure program as outlined by NTA a couple of years ago? Are they patchable? Do they have a UL certification? Things like that. But one of them is increasingly, do you have a software bill of materials, and how good's the hygiene compared to your peers? So within that operator thing, we have begun to, and we would love actionable help from this room to do, is let's go target and harvest use cases and artifacts in each of those squares on this grid. We have a couple of them already. So that one's really the medical type one. I want to wrap up quickly here. To the S2 idea, this might be more, okay, we've already standardized on this manufacturer, but before we do a go live, push or rollout that's going to last 3 to 4 years as a gold image, let's make sure we're using the least vulnerable version of that product from that vendor. Let's make sure we know all of the residual exposures or CVEs so we can put in compensating controls for those, et cetera. And the last one we're calling Supply Vigilance. So again, S1 is supplier selection. S2 is supply selection, often done by an IT or ops team. And number three is supplier vigilance. As a producer of software, for me, supplier vigilance is I have a coordinated vulnerability disclosure that I'm monitoring. I watch Google alerts, I watch NVD, we pay attention to any of our downstream dependent software packages to trigger, do we need to do a patch? So depending on your leg of this relay race, your nouns and verbs change, but your general objectives don't. And what we saw was isolated value in a vertical or in an S column. What we'd love to see is, as our compadres in the standards group create something more homogenized, more consistent, you can see how a consistent line of sight up and down this chain could enable vigilance and action, even when middle companies go out of business. One of the questions, I think, from a trade association earlier was, what counts as a major update or a minor update? Some of the fascinating, very encouraging conversations we've had in the working groups is, this is as delivered as built at build time. So if this is constantly put out as a byproduct of building software, then some of those debates, which are fair questions, may be obviated by some sort of harmonization and standardization.
So let me just add one or two things, and we can wrap this up. I think, while my primary job is fighting Windows autoplay in the images, when I'm not doing that, the other thing that we are doing as part of our group is trying to build on top of this structure that we've put together and actually write up some narratives, some storytelling, right? Not everybody understands what SBOM is. Not everybody can easily relate it to their world. But as we think into the future and think about how do we make a business case, how do we make policy cases and things around that, we're going to need something that's fleshed out, that turns it into a real world scenario that people can can read and understand and see themselves in. So in addition to building out the spreadsheet, which Josh mentioned that he tweeted that out, I think we'll get that up on the NTIA website as well. We want people to come forward with their stories. You can anonymize them if you want, whatever the case may be, but we want to build out the pieces, but we also want to write up those stories, because I think that's going to be a powerful tool, again, particularly for those individuals or organizations who may be new to this, who may not completely understand what we're talking about. So highly encourage you to get involved in that part of it as well. And I think, can we get the spreadsheet up on the website at some point? I think we can do that. I think we'll get that up there. So, I don't, how far did we go? Do we have time for a question now, or do you want us to wait?
Definitely have some time for questions.
Okay.
This is a really important area,
Okay,
and
yeah,
we want
why
to
don't we
make
do
sure that folks know how to contribute. Can you take a step back and talk about what? Thank you. Take a step forward. Do the hook. For the February meeting, what will you have for us, and what do you need from people here to get that?
So I think Josh can start answering that by kind of running through a specific example that we've already started to build out, and then I'll build on top of that with some other things.
Yeah, we realize that picture and framing may be pedantic or rudimentary for some of you, but we also found we were meeting every week with some really passionate folks, and we were ahead of ourselves in a couple cases. We hadn't actually contextualized the work. So here's a concrete cell in this overall graphic. Picture, we're in financial services, S1, procurement, all right? So we interviewed, I won't name the bank unless he chimes in and tells me I can, but we said, what's the persona we're speaking with? And the persona actually in this case was two teammates. One was called a sourcing team within the bank, and they almost are content agnostic. They really don't care what they're sourcing. They're not security experts, but they work with the risk management team to come up with buyer technical requirements and terms and conditions. Basically, sourcing does not, I'm going to read this verbatim in his own words, but sourcing does not stipulate technical requirements, but the buyer org can set those. And we shimmed ourselves in between through something called a master software and licensing agreement template, which is a boilerplate, which can be redlined, but has to be there and answered every time. So the SBOM shimmed in some criterion and said, these are sometimes stricken, they're sometimes modified, and they are always a negotiation opportunity. So this isn't about so much security, it is. They want to generally reduce the risk to the bank. But their attitude was asking for an SBOM creates a negotiation opportunity during procurement for any and all software we buy at the bank. They did have some internal debates about some IoT is so small that maybe it should fly under the radar, but maybe it has a big impact, et cetera, et cetera. But we got into about a 40-minute conversation and captured some artifacts. He referenced a financial services ISAC third-party software working group paper. He referenced a financial services sector coordinating council procurement guide for auditors and assessors. So the FISIC, I think is how you pronounce that, FSSCC. And referenced a new standard called OASIS that he's considering for static analysis in a similar capacity. But I said, how does this really work? Don't tell me the process flow. How does it really work? And essentially they said, and some of them were in the room last time, they always ask for an SBOM now. And if a vendor can provide one, it's a good sign. If they can't provide one, they know it's going to cost more to evaluate, operate, and own this through its life cycle. And I said, so you don't even care what's in the SBOM right now? He said, in the first phase, no. Can they produce one? It's a litmus test or an indicator of the maturity of the organization they're dealing with. Then I pushed a little harder, and I said, what do you do with that fork in the road? And he said, we know that every time there's a new thing, like an Apache Struts 2, we're going to have to do a live evaluation, which is disruptive, expensive, and difficult. So we know that we're going to bake that into the total cost of operations, so we're going to ask for a massive discount on people who cannot provide an SBOM to equip our triage. And they get it because they're a big bank, right? So they bake that into either free maintenance or they bake it into reduced cost because they know they're going to have to augment the cost of ownership, which I thought was logical. I said, where are you taking this? And he said, there's a new process we're adding on top of this, which is called Prohibitive Technology List, or PTL. So they have a few projects that have bit them enough times that are so old and so dangerous or so radioactive that they're now using this same procurement shim to make sure that anyone who's trying to sell a product that has this really, really old junk in it can articulate compensating controls or add additional contractual language, or they just don't get purchased. So they create additional friction and impedance to incentivize people to get on more modern and better maintained software and projects. So this is just an example. It's in the spreadsheet. It's not well formatted, but what our team's been doing week after week is some of us have peeled off. There are more examples than the one I just read. But what we're doing is just saying who works in automotive and can give us an operator S2 thing use case. I'm a developer of IoT middleware, so I'm going to make a use case of myself for some of these things for what we do to select which open source projects are too risky to use. And what we're hoping for from our working groups is we come back each time by February with this entire spreadsheet filled out with one or more concrete use cases with artifacts when they're willing to do so, with company names when they're willing to do so, but we know in some cases they won't. And part of this is to debunk the fact that the fictions that this can't be done or can't be done at scale, because it is being done in a lot of places. Part of this as well is to get the heat map of the divergent nouns and verbs used across these sectors and across these titles. Because if we heat map that and affinitize that, we believe we're going to have some very consistent use cases emerge. And then lastly, these are just a capture of isolated value. They're not a capture of system-wide value. And we believe the opportunity with our companion team of the standards group could make these more consistent, such that they are machine-readable, machine speed, and therefore machine-level value. And the humans can focus on the things that matter.
So the thing I'll add to that, I think Josh got it exactly right. I mean, the concrete examples, the real examples, whether they're complete or partial, I think are the most important in terms of what we're trying to do. But I also think that doing some creative thinking is okay here too, right? Some theoretical examples, challenges that you may have in your organization where you think an SBOM type approach might actually be helpful. You may not be doing it today, but you've got some thoughts on how you might implement it or what that might look like. We're okay getting those ideas as well. Ultimately, as Josh said, the goal here is to try and demonstrate that not only is this working, it can continue to work, it can work in ways that maybe folks haven't thought about or are thinking about but haven't done. We want to paint that entire picture. And so between now and February, that's our hope, right, is to build that out, to have the concrete, but also some of the forward-looking as well to try and bring all that together. So I think we're done at this point. Are you good? So we'll stop here and then maybe a question or two.
So again, just to play back what you just said to make sure I understood the answer to Alan's question. So the intent by February is to have something that looks like what's on the chart there, which has roughly 70-odd squares in it. And for each square, you're going to have something. What's the something that goes with each square? That's where I got a little lost.
So if
you said a lot of words, but what is the actual deliverable?
I'm not happy with how consistently we're capturing use cases, but we want to have an associated doc that captures the persona, the intent, the business process, the artifacts. And once captured, we're going to do some post-processing on affinitizing those. Very different words. I mean, the way that we have an automotive manufacturer in the room, they are very, very good at tier 1, tier 2 supply chain management in physical goods. So those nouns and verbs are more mature in that sector than they are in medical. But, you know, FDA has its own jargon too. So they're going to sound different. One of the things we're trying to do is debunk that by just kind of bringing together the common practices or motions. And then if you go to the third tab in the Google Doc I linked to, there's an unstructured capture in an Excel spreadsheet, which is not ideal. What I think we had hoped to do by this morning, but we did not do because we were working on the graphic, was to have a pretty normal product management 101 per use case capture template that you could just execute. I personally care a little less what method you use because these conversations go organic really quickly, especially if you're talking to a busy hospital procurement person. But I care that we capture them. Yeah.
So, go ahead.
I just have one last comment to make, and then we'll move on. I just wanted to say that it'd be remiss if I didn't point out that one of our group members, Audie Hatch over here, was responsible for putting that graphic together. She did an amazing job under short notice, so neither Josh or I can take any credit for that graphic whatsoever. So I just wanted to make sure we gave credit where credit was due on that.
And I'm actually going to keep you up there for a little bit.
Okay.
Because what I want to do is, since a number of you have sort of emphasized the importance of use cases, and see, one, do you have use cases in mind that we can, you don't have to volunteer, we'll come and guilt you into volunteering afterwards, but just what are some of the things that we can all share now so that we can start thinking about this while we're looking at this. And it's also important if you have a use case that you think doesn't easily map to this chart, because then they'll have to figure out how to put it in. So this is a chance for folks who say, you know, this is what I think this data could be used for.
And $sign other was for real estate. The actual spreadsheet has government things like the FAR and DFAR, and so there are more in the actual spreadsheet.
So Bruce, and then Darren.
Yeah, I had a comment that it would be good if we had a higher level statement of what all of these things are for, other than it just says software, bill of materials. And it seems to me that this effort has two parts to it, which would help answer the question that was asked by a gentleman earlier. And that is that the function of this is two. We've seen a lot of people asking for software bill of materials, a lot of organizations all over the world. But we're not sure what's in their head when they're asking for software bill of materials. And then if we understood that, we would then want to know, why did they want it? Okay, what is it and why do you want it? Or what are the requirements for one? And so it seems to me that the effort here is for two things. One is define what a software bill of materials is. And the other part is define why we want one. And or another way to put it is, you know, what are the requirements for one? But because that hasn't been stated, it's difficult for people who are oriented towards, okay, write your requirements and then we'll try to figure out a solution, or, you know, other people looking at it a different way. So I think it would be good to have an overall statement like that for this effort so that new people joining would understand that.
I think that is a fantastic idea. I'm going to throw the ball back over to Art and Michelle and see, is that sort of the work that you've been trying to get to?
And we're over here conversing because that's exactly the case. Yes. So and Art is actually drafting some things around this right now, because one of the things that we took away from our by the way, this is Michelle Jump from Novalia. One of the things that we took away from our discussion was adding a problem statement to our guidance document, but also defining a little bit more about this. And I think that some of the things that we're looking at here that'll align a bit more with the problem statement are also these foundational objectives, which are also going to speak back to that problem statement as well, I think. Would you agree with that, Art?
Yeah, generally. So I think it was Steve Lipner on the phone asked the problem statement, the why question, which I believe is a route where you're going, Bruce, as well. And I'll claim that our working group is the most responsible, perhaps, for trying to at least propose something there. So we'll try to tackle it.
I mean, it's undeniable that an SBOM it's a means to an unstated end. I think what I was hoping, at least for our corner of the universe, to do is, if we capture the keyword in a use case capture for us is intent. When you start to capture intent, you see the business problems people are attempting to solve. I think the macro level ad hoc for me is we want to dramatically improve the quality and reliability of the software we build and consume and operate. And we believe this can help do that in ways other solutions couldn't. But it is a means to an end. And there may be an alternative or superior means to an end. Some people want to see software liability. So don't tell me what's in it. Just be responsible for what happens if you give me bad stuff. Other people in this room would have a heart attack if we introduce software liability. So SBOM absolutely is an implementation towards unstated things. I'm hoping we at least surface a lot of those use cases and requirements, and that the other working group here elevates it to what are the higher level indicators of success.
Sure, but the question of, you know, using it for making buying decisions is different than using it for determining a vulnerability list.
Right.
And I'm not trying to say which is good or if we should do both, but I don't think a lot of people understand that those are open as, you know, requirements.
Yeah, and that's why we wanted not one use case per vertical, but, and in fact, today I said this already, we keep saying security use cases. Deming did not do this to make safer cars. The Unsafe Identity Speed book came out in the 70s, 30 years later. He did it to make profitable cars. So there are many use cases here that are business enablement or agility or profitability that we should not overlook, especially if we're trying to sell this for greater adoption.
No, well, I was just going to say too, I think just from a process perspective, I think one of your point is well taken. I think, in part, what has happened for all of our groups is we all left the start line at the same time. And I think as we've been kind of going through this parallel processing, we sort of arrived at a similar conclusion, which is we're trying to define that problem statement through all of the work that we're all doing and trying to arrive at it together, as opposed to having that problem statement right from the get-go. I think there was a sense that we actually have to get through this process a little bit, let the working groups do their different pieces, and now we're starting to get to the point where that problem statement is starting to come together, or realistically problem statements, right, to your point. So I think we're close with that. I think we've been working very closely with the framing group as well, and I think we're at the point where we can start to lay this out, and then hopefully through our group and the others, we can start to demonstrate how the use cases that we're putting together actually go towards addressing that problem statement.
And the tactical opportunity, and I'm looking right at Afton from FDA, is they have an incredibly clear objective, an incredibly clear set of use cases. It's a subset of all of these.
So, Josh, I think that group is going to talk a little bit later. So I wanted just again to see if there's anyone either in the room or on the phone who said, I have a use case that you guys should capture, and make sure that while we have this opportunity. Darren.
So I have Duncan Sparrow from S. Fractal Consulting. Don't worry, everybody takes my first name and last name and mushes them together into Daryl. I have a use case I'd like you to consider, which I guess means I'm volunteering. But I'm a security geek and a software developer. Now that I'm retired, I work a lot in the open source area in writing open source security software. And this is sort of the first thing the Air Force ever attacks is the radar system. So as a hacker, first thing you have to go after is the security systems. I do think the cobbler's children go barefoot a lot in the security industry, and there should be a security use case on software that you use for security should be following all these rules.
Fantastic. We'll follow up with you on how to drill down to precision. He's right. Yeah.
And Omar Santos from Cisco. And first, kudos to the illustration. I think even if you focus on medical devices, it applies to a lot of things. The only comment is, of course, we can comment or we can bring 20,000 use cases right now, so the scope, you probably have to narrow it. I would suggest to, and I like the example you have with the cloud, because the way that we develop software nowadays, including from open source, to things that, again, I'm coming from Cisco, we inherit a lot of things from upstream providers, also from downstream providers, as well as lateral. The Apache struts that you had in there, probably in the use case of the cloud, there are probably 20, 30 different points that can be different attacks. So are you addressing, because you can run into scope creep, are you addressing that within your discussions right now?
I'll let this group talk about what they've talked about. One thing that I want to ask, and maybe we can talk about this afternoon, you hit a great point. It is a cliche to say that the line between on-prem and cloud is blurring. And so I think something this group needs to think about is what does this notion of software transparency mean when we're dealing with something that's not just on-prem software. And I think we should have a discussion about what makes that use case similar and what makes it different. And maybe we need to drill more into fleshing out the set of use cases for on-prem, but I think we should certainly start that conversation today.
I can't help but think like a hacker, so some of the use cases we're harvesting, even though we kind of left this room on July 19th saying maybe cloud services and SaaS were out of scope, I don't think they're going to stay out of scope. So I think that our interviews will pull them back into scope, and I think it'll be more similar than different. I think, and it was very important that we focused on concrete, harvestable things people are doing as the crawl stage. Maybe between now and February we do the walk stage and then the run stage. But I have a hunch it's less about what is the SBOM. It's more about how does one consume it, like an interrogatable API or something. But they become very necessary, especially in ad hoc mashups and microservices, and we can't ignore it, right? We don't want to solve for the past.
All right. Any last comments on the idea of a use case? I have Daniel Beard is on the phone.
Hey, hello. So kind of going off what Josh was saying for profitability, we started doing SBOMs for security reasons and open source compliance reasons. And what we found out was that there was an awful lot of libraries in the devices we were making that we didn't need. So by taking them out, we were able to reduce times, increase performance, use cheaper chips. So there's actually a business reason why these are good.
Yeah, we used to call that code bloat. Like when you look at your SBOM, there's a lot of stuff and there's a lot of old stuff, and it makes you go, ugh. But then you start cleaning it up, and I think Rob Suarez from the task force said he did 7 package updates and got rid of over 1,400 vulnerabilities by just updating 7 packages. A lot of people say, do I really need this thing? So, that Brandeis quote of sunlight's the best disinfectant, sometimes the act of simply starting this journey ends up getting you to weed out the bloat, the elective attack surface, an elective risk.
All right. Thank you, John. Thank you, Josh.